What would happen if Russia used nuclear weapons on Ukraine? A chilling question indeed, but let's explore the potential outcomes. To understand the gravity of this question, let's take a step back. The story of nuclear weapons is a tale as old as the Second World War. Born out of a race to develop the most destructive force known to mankind, these weapons have since cast a long, ominous shadow over international relations. Today, there are 9 countries that possess these instruments of devastation, Russia being one of them. And as we speak, the tensions between Russia and Ukraine are palpable, adding a new layer of unease to a world already riddled with uncertainty. The relationship between Russia and Ukraine has been fraught with tension for years, the seeds of which were sown long before the current crisis. From disputes over natural gas supplies to disagreements on political alignment, the two nations have been at odds on multiple fronts. The use of nuclear weapons, however, is a different ballgame altogether. It's not just about the immediate, horrifying destruction of life and infrastructure. The ripple effects would be far-reaching and long-lasting, causing an environmental disaster, global fallout, nuclear retaliation, global instability, a humanitarian crisis, and an economic collapse. But let's not forget, the use of nuclear weapons isn't just a matter of 2 countries. It's a global concern. The fallout from a nuclear explosion doesn't respect national boundaries. It would affect countless countries, and the radiation could circle the globe. We must also consider the international response. The use of nuclear weapons would inevitably prompt international intervention. The global community has a vested interest in preventing nuclear warfare, not just because of the immediate danger it poses, but because of the precedent it would set. These weapons of mass destruction should not be used at all. The problems between nations should be solved diplomatically, through dialogue, not through a show of force that could potentially end in catastrophe. Now, let's delve into the potential aftermath of such a catastrophic event. First and foremost, the immediate result would be massive destruction. Now let's delve into that. The sheer power of a nuclear weapon is nothing short of apocalyptic. Imagine, if you will, a city thriving with life, bustling with activity, reduced to nothing but a haunting, smoky silhouette in a matter of seconds. The destructive force of a nuclear weapon is twofold. The initial blast obliterates everything within its reach, instantly vaporizing buildings, landmarks, and tragically people. This is no ordinary explosion. The heat generated rivals that of the sun, causing an intense fireball that incinerates everything within its radius. But the destruction doesn't stop at the blast radius. The shockwave that follows the explosion flattens structures miles away from the epicenter, causing a domino effect of destruction. It's a ripple that races outwards, demolishing everything in its path, like a cruel hand wiping clean a meticulously set-up domino display. And then there's the loss of life. It's difficult to comprehend the scale of human tragedy that would ensue. Thousands, if not millions of lives snuffed out in an instant, with countless more left injured or suffering. The human cost of such an event is staggering, a grim toll that no number can truly encapsulate. Beyond this, the infrastructure that forms the backbone of a functioning society, hospitals, schools, power plants, transportation networks, would be decimated. The very fabric of the community would be torn asunder, leaving survivors in a world unrecognizable from what it was mere moments before. And it's not just the physical structures. The social and political infrastructure would also crumble under the weight of such a catastrophe. Government services would be disrupted, law and order could break down, and the societal norms we take for granted could be upended. In essence, a nuclear strike is not just an attack on a location, but an assault on the very threads that hold society together. It's a cataclysm that changes the landscape, both physically and metaphorically, forever. But the devastation doesn't stop there. The aftermath of a nuclear attack carries with it a multitude of disastrous consequences that extend far beyond the initial destruction. Following the immediate destruction, the environment would suffer a disastrous blow. Picture this: a nuclear weapon detonates, releasing an abundance of energy in the form of light, heat, and a shockwave. But the aftermath is more insidious. The explosion, you see, also releases radioactive particles into the atmosphere, creating what we know as nuclear fallout. This fallout is not just a one-time event. It behaves like an unwanted guest that overstays its welcome. These radioactive particles linger in the environment, contaminating the air, water and soil. They're like invisible poison, spreading far and wide, carried by wind and rain. Now let's consider the effects on wildlife and vegetation. Imagine a forest, teeming with life. Birds chirping, squirrels scampering, trees reaching for the sky. Now imagine that same forest, but under the influence of nuclear fallout. The radiation can cause genetic mutations in plants and animals, leading to deformities, disease, and often death. The forest, once a symbol of life, could transform into a symbol of death and decay. Even the insects, often the most resilient of creatures, are not spared. Bees, butterflies and other pollinators would be affected, disrupting the vital process of pollination. Without pollination, plants can't reproduce. Without plants, herbivores can't survive. Without herbivores, carnivores can't survive. It's a domino effect, a breakdown of the entire ecosystem. And then there's the soil. Soil, the lifeblood of any ecosystem, would become contaminated, affecting agriculture and food supply. Crops would fail, livestock would perish, and the food chain would be irreparably damaged. The water, too, would not be immune. Rivers, lakes, and oceans would become repositories of radioactive waste, endangering aquatic life and contaminating our precious water supply. And remember, radiation doesn't respect borders. The fallout could travel hundreds, even thousands of miles, affecting areas far beyond the initial blast site. The damage, however, would not be confined to the immediate vicinity. The fallout from a nuclear explosion doesn't respect borders. Like a cruel game of dominoes, the radioactive aftermath of a nuclear attack would rapidly expand beyond its original epicenter, creating a global catastrophe that's as indiscriminate as it is devastating. Let's consider the way radiation travels. It's not confined to a specific geographic area. It rides on the wind, seeping into the atmosphere and spreading across continents. Its reach is not bound by political treaties or national allegiances. It's a silent, invisible threat that lingers in the air, the water and the soil, poisoning everything it touches. Imagine this: a nuclear explosion in Ukraine. The initial blast is unimaginably destructive, yes, but it's just the beginning. The fallout, a toxic cocktail of radioactive particles, is catapulted into the atmosphere. Carried by prevailing winds, these particles can travel thousands of miles from the blast site. Countries far removed from the initial conflict, from Poland to France, from Sweden to Spain, could find themselves under a deadly, invisible rain. This radioactive fallout doesn't just pose a threat to human life. It contaminates our food chains, our water sources, our ecosystems. It's a slow-burning disaster with effects that could last for decades, even centuries. Entire species could be wiped out, ecosystems destroyed, and agricultural sectors decimated. And remember, these effects are not confined to the borders of the country where the explosion occurred. This is a global fallout. The human cost, too, would be unimaginable. The radiation sickness, the cancers, the genetic mutations passed down through generations. These are the tragic legacies of nuclear fallout. And let's not forget the psychological trauma, the fear of an invisible, omnipresent threat that can't be fought or fled. And in the midst of this global crisis, retaliation could be a grim reality. Because, as history has shown us, the use of nuclear weapons often sparks a chain reaction, prompting other nations to respond in kind. It's a terrifying, self-perpetuating cycle of destruction, one that we must do everything in our power to prevent. In response to a nuclear attack, retaliation is a real possibility. It's a chilling thought, but nuclear retaliation is not just a plot for a dystopian novel. It's a real-world scenario that could occur if a nuclear strike were launched. This brings us to a terrifying principle known as mutual assured destruction, or MAD. MAD is a doctrine of military strategy and national security policy in which a full-scale use of nuclear weapons by two or more opposing sides would cause the complete annihilation of both the attacker and the defender. It's a grim form of deterrence, where the threat of using strong weapons against the enemy prevents the enemy's use of those same weapons. The world could quickly spiral into a state of all-out nuclear war with devastating and far-reaching consequences. While retaliation could seem like a logical response to an initial attack, the aftermath would be anything but logical. This escalation could lead to unprecedented global instability. A nuclear attack would undoubtedly plunge the world into a period of profound instability. The ripple effects of such a catastrophic event would reverberate far beyond the immediate area of impact. Political landscapes would drastically shift as nations grapple with the new reality. Allies could turn into foes, while long-standing disputes might become inflamed in the face of shared adversity. The balance of power could be tipped, creating an unpredictable and tense geopolitical climate. Simultaneously, the social fabric of societies worldwide would be tested. Fear and uncertainty could lead to widespread panic and civil unrest. The very norms and values that hold communities together might be threatened as people struggle to come to terms with the enormity of the situation. Economically, the repercussions could be equally severe. Global markets could plummet, trade may be disrupted, and the world could potentially slide into a recession, if not a depression. Yet, amidst this chaos, the human toll would be the most tragic. Opening. The humanitarian crisis following a nuclear attack would be unparalleled. Imagine a world where homes are reduced to rubble, where cities are transformed into ghost towns overnight. This is the reality of a nuclear attack. The human cost is immense, and it's not just about the immediate loss of life. The aftermath of such an event would lead to a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. Displacement would be the first wave of the crisis. Millions of people would be forced to abandon their homes, their communities, their very lives, fleeing from the radioactive fallout. They would become refugees in their own countries, or even in foreign lands, their lives thrown into disarray in the blink of an eye. But displacement is just the beginning. Famine would quickly follow, with farmlands poisoned by radiation, crops would fail, livestock would perish, the food supply chain would be disrupted, leading to severe shortages. Hunger would become a constant companion for those who managed to survive the initial blast. And then there's disease. The radiation would contaminate water sources, making it unsafe for consumption. With the healthcare system in ruins, treatable conditions could become deadly. The spread of infectious diseases would be rampant, as displaced populations crammed into temporary shelters with little to no sanitation facilities. Death would be a constant spectre, not just from the direct effects of radiation sickness, but from the indirect consequences of the crisis. Malnutrition, dehydration, exposure to the elements, lack of medical care. All these factors would contribute to a significantly increased mortality rate. In the face of such a crisis, the global community would need to respond with unprecedented levels of aid. But even with the best intentions, the sheer scale of the disaster would make it almost impossible to meet the needs of all those affected. Closing. The economic consequences of such a crisis would be dire. Not only would the cost of rebuilding be astronomical, but the loss of human capital, the disruption to trade and the strain on global resources would send shockwaves through the world economy. The ripple effects of a nuclear attack extend far beyond the blast radius, touching every corner of the globe. The economic repercussions of a nuclear attack would be far-reaching and devastating. Imagine a world where the global economy, already a complex and delicately balanced system, is thrown into chaos. The immediate impact would be the destruction of infrastructure, leading to a collapse of industry and commerce in the affected region. But the ripple effect would spread far beyond the borders of the war zone. Global trade would be disrupted, leading to scarcity of goods and skyrocketing prices. The world's financial markets would crumble under the weight of uncertainty and fear. Investors would pull out, currencies would plummet, and a global recession or even depression could follow. The cost of humanitarian aid, coupled with the expense of rebuilding, would strain the economies of even the wealthiest nations. The world's poor would be hit hardest, widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots. In the face of such a catastrophe, international intervention would be inevitable. International intervention would be essential in the aftermath of a nuclear attack. In such a catastrophic scenario, global bodies like the United Nations would be expected to step up, mediating dialogues between nations and coordinating relief efforts. Alliances such as NATO could find themselves in a precarious position, grappling with the decision of whether or not to retaliate, and if so, how. Emerging from this would be a heightened global tension as countries wrestle with their responsibilities and alliances. This could potentially spark off a global conflict, further escalating the crisis. The role of international intervention would be a delicate balancing act, to provide immediate relief and support while preventing the situation from spiraling into a larger conflict. Such an intervention would require unprecedented cooperation and diplomacy among nations, highlighting the importance of dialogue and peaceful resolution over violent retaliation. In light of these potential outcomes, it's clear that nuclear weapons should never be used. The catastrophic consequences of nuclear warfare underscore the importance of diplomacy. As we've seen, the potential for destruction, environmental disaster, global fallout, retaliation and instability, humanitarian crisis, economic collapse, and the inevitable necessity for international intervention paints a grim picture. But there's another path. Diplomacy, the art and practice of conducting negotiations between nations, stands as our best defense against such dire outcomes. It's through dialogue that we can address grievances, negotiate terms, and find common ground. It's through peaceful conflict resolution that we can prevent tensions from escalating into full-blown warfare. In the end, diplomacy is not just about politics or international relations, it's about valuing human life and our shared planet. It's about understanding that we all have more to lose in war than we could ever gain. After all, the survival of humanity could very well depend on it.